We remember Rome as the absolute master of the ancient world. At its peak, its legions marched across borders to enforce a level of physical and military dominance that seemed entirely unbreakable. This image shows the paved Appian Way, a surviving artery of their massive engineering network. These extensive roads allowed troops, supplies, and communications to move with such speed that the physical infrastructure itself projected permanent, invincible order. That infrastructure connected an administration that controlled millions of people, stretching across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. For centuries, a single capital dictated the daily lives of a diverse population across 3 different continents. Because of this staggering scale and longevity, we tend to view the Roman system as the ultimate benchmark. We study their laws, copy their architecture, and treat their civilization as the peak of human achievement in antiquity. But time has a habit of scrubbing away the grime. The marble ruins we photograph today have been thoroughly sanitized by centuries of myth-making. The state was already consuming itself long before any foreign invaders reached the gates. The very systems built to power Roman growth, slavery, extraction, and absolute rule, eventually became the engines of its internal rot. If we want to understand why the empire actually fractured, we have to look past the golden statues. We have to examine the human cost buried directly beneath the foundation. Rome's expansion required massive amounts of manual labor. Captured soldiers, civilian populations from conquered territories, and even children were funneled into a massive, state-sponsored machine of forced labor. These gold and silver coins show the immense capital flowing into the city. Men and women died in toxic, collapsing mines to extract the raw materials that minted this currency, funding the extravagant lifestyles of a tiny elite. The Roman legal system efficiently categorized millions of living beings as property. To the state, they were agricultural tools that happened to speak, entirely stripped of rights to ensure the imperial economy never paused. Building an economy dependent on constant expansion and mass human suffering created a highly fragile system. When the borders eventually stopped expanding, the influx of forced labor dried up, leaving the state with a massive economic deficit it could not fill. Controlling a massive, heavily taxed civilian population required a psychological strategy alongside military force. The state weaponized public entertainment to keep the masses distracted and compliant. While modern movies frame the gladiator as a romantic, honorable duelist, the physical arenas were slaughterhouses. These games were highly organized, state-sponsored public executions designed to showcase the complete dominance of the empire over its enemies. This mosaic displays the arena's reality. Fighters face off alongside exotic animals imported to tear apart unarmed prisoners. Notice the figure labeled Calamorius collapsing, a specific individual dying for the crowd. The state used this extreme violence to redirect public anger onto the sand. When you condition an entire population to view agonizing death as a weekend pastime, empathy vanishes. The public became so numb to the brutality in the arena that they completely ignored the rapid erosion of their own civic institutions. That numbness at the bottom eventually infected the very top. The absolute power granted to the imperial throne began to warp the minds of the men who sat on it. This bust of Caligula represents what happens when a human being is handed the power of a god with zero accountability. His reign devolved into cruelty, paranoia, and the erratic execution of his own allies, which paralyzed the government. This engraving illustrates another emperor, Nero, allegedly performing on the lyre while the Great Fire consumed the city. Whether he played an instrument or not, the image captures a deep historical truth. The leadership had completely detached itself from the suffering of its citizens. These rulers were the natural output of the system. An empire that governed through sheer force and systemic exploitation was practically engineered to produce paranoid, sociopathic dictators. With the imperial court bogged down in continuous assassinations, bribery, and madness, basic administration fell apart. The central brain of Rome could no longer process the massive logistical challenges of running the state. The vast interconnected network we saw earlier began to splinter. Trade routes snapped, local commanders hoarded resources, and the provincial borders dissolved into isolated, self-serving factions. The Roman Empire looked invincible, but inside, it was rotting. And the civilian population was completely exhausted by heavy taxation and internal chaos. When invading armies finally crossed the borders in force, they were pushing against an empty shell. The society had already eroded the physical and moral pillars that held it up. We choose to remember the architects, the philosophers, and the sprawling colosseums. We write legends about their conquests because the reality is deeply uncomfortable. The Roman ruins stand as physical proof that endless expansion has a terminal cost. If a civilization relies on systematic cruelty to maintain its wealth, all the military might in the world cannot stop it from eating itself. And sometimes, the greatest empires carry the darkest secrets. This is Veil of Empire.